Ah, students, wonderful. Welcome to today's special lecture. I am Professor Gerr E Mander, and I'll be sharing with you the fascinating reality of voter ID laws, particularly in regard to the United States. Allow me to introduce my assistant for this lecture, Frizzle. Say hello, Frizzle.
Hello, Frizzle.
Yes, well, Frizzle will be assisting with visual aids today. We have a great deal to cover and so very little time, so let's get cracking.
That's easy. They're laws that identify voters.
You are almost right. Voter ID laws are enacted to require voters to provide state or government identification in order to cast a valid ballot, usually involving the requirement for some sort of photo identification.
Hey, that's me.
Indeed. So now that we know what voter ID laws are, we can discuss what they do, or perhaps more realistically, what they are supposed to do. The simple explanation is that voter ID laws are intended to combat voter fraud. Voter fraud happens very seldom in the United States, and David Wilson and Paul Brewer find that public conception of it seems to follow political party affiliation. So if the intended consequence of these laws is to avoid voter fraud, what unintended consequences might they have?
Horror. The fall of democracy. A plague of rabbits.
Rabbits?
I'm a sock. They scare me.
And voter ID laws are going to cause a plague of rabbits.
Well, yeah, they sound bad.
They do, and to many people, any call for voter ID laws is taken as a thinly veiled attempt to disenfranchise minority voters.
But doesn't everyone have an ID?
It is true that most of us have ID, but it is not hard to imagine the hurdles acquiring an ID or reacquiring an ID could cause. Do you know where your birth certificate is, Frizzle?
My mom does.
But what if, terribly sorry to say this, something happened to your mother? Or something happened to your certificate? How would you go about getting a replacement? If you were poor, how would you pay for that replacement? Do you know the hours of the registrar's office in the county where you were born?
I'd never thought of that.
Indeed, and that doesn't even scratch the surface of other issues. In a 2013 study, Burden and Neiheisel conclude that many rural precincts lack the oversight and organization to implement new regulations without potentially disenfranchising voters of any demographic.
Okay, but if they do all this bad stuff, why are they legal?
Well, sometimes they're not. Frequently, state voter ID laws are challenged in court. Often they're found to have negligible impact on voters, or to have the same impact on all voters. Sometimes, as in the case of Missouri's 2006 voter identification law, a court finds that the cost of getting an ID constitutes a poll tax.
Well, that's where the southern states used to charge people to vote so that only rich people voted.
Yes, and it is sadly important to remember that poll taxes were not made illegal in federal elections until the Voter Rights Amendment of 1964. So now that we've covered what voter ID laws are, and a little about what they do, we can examine what that means for the voter. Why does that impact you?
Well, because it's my government and I should be allowed to vote. And if everybody can't vote, then that's not fair.
Very good, Frizzle. Representative government requires engaged citizens. Can you think of any other reasons you or the other students might care?
No.
Politicians, political pundits, and the media bring up voter ID laws frequently. If you know what something is, it's harder for someone else to convince you to blindly take their side. Remember, despite all the potential issues with voter ID laws, Professor Guaghan concludes they've actually been shown to drive up voter turnout.
Why is that?
Likely because of their controversial nature. When one is enacted, there is a groundswell of civic engagement by citizens who feel their voting rights are being threatened. Ah, that, Frizzle, is a compelling reason for you to understand voter ID laws. That is the voter ID law for Virginia, where we live. There is a link in the course materials that covers it and tells you all the different forms of ID you're allowed to use in Virginia elections. And that, class, brings us to the end of our presentation. We've learned what voter ID laws are, what they do, and why you should care about them as an engaged citizen and voter. Tune in for the next lecture in this series, where we cover what voting precincts are, how they're made, and why many of them are controversial. Thank you for joining Frizzle and I today for this special presentation. Say goodbye, Frizzle.
Assistant Frizzle out.